As a consequence of that, or taking advantage of that, Syria's rebels have swept through south from their stronghold in Idlib, as you say, through Aleppo. Now they've taken Hama almost unopposed.
Let's start our show with developments in Syria, because the Syrian civil war appears to have been reignited after rebels opposing President Assad staged a shock assault on the country's second largest city of Aleppo. The Syrian army retreated this morning, giving up control of the city to the rebels. In response, Russian and Syrian warplanes have been bombing targets in the suburbs of Aleppo, the first airstrikes on the city in 8 years. Now, since Wednesday, the rebel forces have made gains in northwestern Syria, reclaiming more than 50 towns and villages before moving into western Aleppo on Friday night. Now, just before we came on air, I spoke with Shashank Joshi, who is defence editor at The Economist, to explain the significance of this escalation.
Well, it's very simple in some ways. Rebels in Syria have seized pretty much most of the country's second biggest city, Aleppo, and this is a huge deal because the battle lines have not fundamentally changed for quite a while, for years. Russia has been launching airstrikes. It's the first time Russia's done that in, I think, about 8 years. And the speed with which the Syrian armed forces have fallen away and fallen back is nothing short of extraordinary. So effectively, it's a sudden shaking up of Syria's conflict.
And does this mean that Assad is going to lose control, or is it too early to think about that?
No, I think it's much too early to say that. Of course, what this represents is a hollowing out of the Syrian armed forces and the Syrian state that's been occurring over a number of years. There's no doubt about that. A loss of legitimacy, a loss of cohesion, a loss of strength. It's also to do with the distraction and weakening of Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group, which has been battered by Israel and which had been earlier intervening in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime. But that's not necessarily to say that Assad's national grip on power is finished. He himself is thought to be in Moscow talking to Putin, discussing the situation. But I think we'd have to see developments in other parts of Syria more definitively to say that his days were numbered just yet.
And in terms of the Russian involvement, given that Russia is also fighting this big conflict with Ukraine, have the other side kind of taken advantage of that? Was Russia busy looking at Ukraine rather than Syria?
It was, although it should be said that Russia's principal contribution to the Syrian war was not ground forces. It wasn't the stuff that it's principally using in Ukraine. It was air power. It was air power, and you could actually say that years ago the Russian and joint Russian-Syrian bombing of cities like Aleppo really prefigured the bombing of Ukrainian cities that we would see after 2022. So there is still Russian air power in Syria. They've continued that. There's also Russian mercenaries in Syria, the group that was once called the Wagner Group, more recently, the Africa Corps, essentially Russian state-backed mercenaries. So they are still active. I think the key meaning of this is that the Russians haven't got necessarily much spare capacity to send to the regime in the way that they would have done perhaps 2 or 3 years ago.
And tell us about these rebels. Are they Islamists? Are they connected to Al Qaeda? Who are they?
Well, HTS, they're undoubtedly Islamist by any reasonable definition. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. I think the interesting thing is that they publicly split with Al Qaeda in 2017. And what's happened since then is that they're still an Islamist group, of course, but what they've done is crack down on Al Qaeda and IS, Islamic State cells in their stronghold, which is Idlib province. And they've tried to basically mainstream themselves. So they've got allies in Turkey. Turkey has played a pretty important role in this week's events from everything that we can see. They've tried to sort of effectively reach out to the international community, try and look more pragmatic, look more normal. They have basically said they're not interested in transnational jihad, so not interested in kind of conducting violence outside of Syria. There are still some people who are skeptical of this, who think ultimately they haven't changed their roots. They would would still sort of, that's in their DNA, but they've been fundamentally changed, I think, in the last several years in a somewhat less radical direction, which is not to say they're a cuddly, friendly group that would, feel normal in average European politics.
And so it looks like they have taken control of the majority of Aleppo. What do you think comes next in Syria?
Actually, I think it's now the key is how far can they go? We're seeing the Syrian armed forces fall back from positions south of Aleppo. They're clearly consolidating. They're reeling. They're completely disoriented. And I think we'll have to see whether there's a kind of domino or cascade effect, and particularly whether places in other parts of Syria, whether we also see the regime's authority challenged. I think the really interesting thing for me, reflecting on the geopolitics of all this, Aisha, is that 10 years ago, Russia and America were important forces in Syria. America still has special forces inside Syria backing Kurdish-dominated militia groups in the north. And of course, similarly, the Russians are still there. But the Turks have become much more influential, and many of the Gulf Arab countries, like the United Arab Emirates, that once backed anti-Assad rebels, they are now reaching out to the Assad regime. So the whole politics of the conflict has been shaken up and reshuffled since the time when your listeners may last remember reading much about it or listening much about it.
Well, I think what many of my listeners, and I remember this myself very vividly, was of course the vote on whether Britain should get involved in airstrikes, which ended up being sort of defeated. That was a very contentious moment. People still remember that. What do you think this will mean for Britain, or what do you think Britain's response will be to this?
I think they'll be dealing with it one step at a time because I'm not sure they'll have seen this coming. I don't think many Western governments appear to have seen this coming. I think they'll have to decide, do they want to encourage many of these rebel groups? They'll be talking to the Turkish government, which will have the most intimate understanding on the ground. The Americans will be asking, how does this affect their own Kurdish allies? Because as Turkish-backed groups advance, the Kurdish groups will also be having to sort of maneuver the situation very delicately. And the Americans will be asking, where does this leave their position? But by and large, I think this is not going to be shaped by what the UK or France or the United States says or does in the next few days. This is going to be shaped principally by dynamics and forces internal to Syria.
And what will Iran think about this?
Oh, well, Iran's going to be very deeply concerned. Iran was also, along with Russia, a major supporter of the Assad regime. Iran was certainly no friend of groups like HTS, who it views as dangerous Sunni Islamist radicals threatening their own position in the region, but also threatening Muslim minorities in Syria. That's the Iranian view. They'll be asking how can they continue to back the Assad regime. But of course, as I said at the beginning, this is occurring in part because Iran's ally Hezbollah and Iran itself, to some degree, have been weakened and distracted by the events of the last 6 months. They've been smashed by the Israelis, to put it very simply. So Iran's not necessarily going to be in a political or military position to extend massive amounts of support to a regime that it once backed to the hilt.
And final, a couple of questions to Shashank. Assad has gone to meet Putin. I mean, Putin's very focused on this Ukraine conflict. How much time and bandwidth will Russia give to what's happening in Syria, given what's happening in Ukraine?
I think they'll be paying very close attention, not least because Assad is in Moscow now, as far as we know, although the Russian government isn't commenting on it publicly. And so they'll be asking, this is a threat to our position. We can't allow this government to fall. That would be a major Western victory. It would weaken our position in the region. It would weaken our reputation with Iran. It would weaken our prestige. I think they'll be very concerned about that. But they'll also have to balance the resources that they're sending to Syria, given how much they need in Ukraine. So Russia will be, I think, really, really closely invested. On top of that, of course, it's worth mentioning, Russia also maintains a naval facility in Tartus on the Mediterranean coast, which is very important to the Russian Navy's position in the Med. And I think that from their perspective, they will, let's remember here, they are the ones who came in 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, I think, in saving saving the regime, stepping in and effectively bailing it out. So they will not want to see Assad go down.
Gosh, it's so interesting, isn't it? So Russia's going to be potentially fighting on a number of fronts, and all the interconnected geopolitics is fascinating. And final question to you: what do you think this means for ordinary people in Syria?
Well, it means initially more violence, more fighting, more bombing. And whilst there are many, many people in Aleppo who are obviously delighted by the news of the defeat of the regime, a regime that's very widely despised, there's no question of that. I think there will be questions over what will HTS be doing in terms of how it governs the areas that it's conquering. There certainly have been concerns over some of the other areas it's governed and the way it's done so. But I think there'll
And just
also
quickly,
be
jump in, how does it treat women?
Well, I mean, it's changed over time, but it's a conservative political Islamist group. So, of course, it's not running these places in a highly liberal fashion. What it has done in recent days is reach out to Christian communities in the area, saying, actually, we're not interested in kind of highly sectarian policies. We're interested in sort of ruling pragmatically. But I think I recently, earlier this morning, read over the State Department's human rights report for Syria for the last 2 years, and they expressed very grave concerns about HTS, and particularly its treatment of political opposition, the way it detains people, the occurrence of torture. So, I don't think HTS is unique in this regard. You could say the same for many rebel or kind of organizations, many warlords inside the country. There's nothing unique about that in that sense. But I think the people will be asking a lot of these questions. And I think finally, they'll be worried about the response from the regime, because as I said, the Russians have begun bombing again for the first time since 2016. The Syrian regime will be conducting strikes. These are not going to be, precise, precision-guided strikes. They're going to be pretty brutal, pretty vicious, and I think the result's going to be a lot of civilian harm in the coming days.
Syria's President Assad says his country will defend its stability and territorial integrity after rebels appear to have taken control of most of the country's second largest city, Aleppo. We can speak to Stephanie Glynn, who is Middle East correspondent for the Sunday Times. She's based in Istanbul. She's keeping across this story for us. Morning, Stephanie.
Good morning.
Do we have a sense of how much control rebel forces have right now? Are they completely in control of Aleppo?
Yes, it's very interesting. They have taken Aleppo. They've also taken Aleppo airport, and they've also made their way down further south towards the capital, Damascus. Of course, there are many other cities in the way. They've now made it towards a city called Hama, which is sort of between Aleppo and then another big city, Homs. So they are continuously proceeding. They are making their way further south. And of course, this is very much concerning for the Assad regime. A lot of the soldiers fled. Assad has, of course, also said that they will be ramping up and that they will be fighting the opposition. And at the same time, the opposition has made large gains. I mean, if we are thinking about when this started, this was on Wednesday. And since Wednesday, the opposition has taken Aleppo, lots of other villages and smaller towns on the way. So those are huge parts of the country in northern Syria.
And when we talk about the rebels, I mean, it's a loose term for who these people are. Just explain the types of people they are. In some cases, they're Islamists.
Yeah, so exactly, rebels is a very, very loose term. So who we have here is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, short HTS. And they are a group mostly based out of Idlib, the province in the northwest of Syria. They are former al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate. So yes, they do, or they have been considered as an extremist group. They've now distanced themselves from al-Qaeda. They also sort of rebranding as more moderate. I mean, if we are looking at the statements in the last couple of days, their leadership has said that Christians, churches, all people, all civilians need to be protected. If soldiers are if government soldiers are surrendering, then these people should also be protected, is what they've been saying. And of course, the goal of the HTS has been to fight the Assad regime. That's what they've been doing. Like I said, they have been mostly based out of the Idlib province. And from there, they are now advancing. Now, having said that, of course, people in Syria, there are sort of mixed feelings. We have people on one hand, they are relieved that the Assad regime is being fought. A lot of people have, of course, left Syria because of Assad, because of the civil war that's been going on for 13 years. And people are celebrating. They're saying, we can now maybe go home. We can go to our towns. We can go to our villages. This might be good for Syria. At the same time, I'm also hearing a lot of opinions or a lot of concerns saying HTC is an extremist group. What does this mean for us? How are they going to rule our areas? So there's a little bit concern with that as well. But at the same time, a lot of people are saying it's good that these areas are being so-called liberated because they do not want the Assad regime to be controlling the country.
And of course, we know that Russia has been supporting the Assad regime for a long time. Clearly, Russia's attention in recent years has turned to Ukraine. I know there have been Russian airstrikes, but just talk to us a little bit about the backers of the Assad regime. If we're looking at Russia, if we're looking at Iran, they are people with other things on their mind other than the situation in Syria. And I wonder if that's why the rebels have chosen this moment. Have they seen it as kind of a weakening of Assad's allies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're looking at previous opposition assaults, Russia especially has been essentially carpet bombing areas where the opposition was trying to make advances. Russia, of course, has been with the Assad regime, has been supporting, especially with air power. But Russia right now, of course, is busy in Ukraine, and other allies of Assad, such as Iran, such as Hezbollah, who have also always been fighting alongside Assad, have been weakened. Of course, we have the war in Lebanon. We have seen Iran and Hezbollah severely weakened by Israel. And again, there's a lot happening in Lebanon right now. There's the war in Gaza. So yes, many of Assad's allies have other agendas at the same time. And what we've seen in the last days is that there has been, of course, support, but a lot less support than we've previously seen from Russia, especially in terms of air support. And if we're looking at Hezbollah, of course, they are very much busy in Lebanon, and they would have previously been very much fighting with Assad. And in the last couple of months, especially ever since the war sort of spiraled out of control in Lebanon and Israeli attacks basically targeted most of the country, we've also seen a lot of people in Lebanon, also people affiliated with Hezbollah, leaving to Syria to find refuge. So the entire situation was a very, very good time for the HTS to say, we are now attacking the Assad regime. He is in the weakest possible position he could have been in recent years. And this is a good time for us to now take action.
How dangerous a time is this right now for Syria? I mean, you've talked about how the civilian population don't quite know which way this is going to go and whether this is a liberation or whether these rebels are actually potentially going to threaten them in the longer term. What's your sense of how dangerous this point in time is for Syria?
Yeah, it's certainly a very uncertain time. Even if we've looked at the last couple of days, we've had more than 300 people have already been killed. And let's remember this war, since it started in 2011, has taken about 500,000 people. So a lot of people have been killed. How dangerous is it right now for Syria? It's certainly very, very uncertain. Assad, since the war started in 2011, so for 13 years it's been going on. So since then we've seen Assad crack down on pro-democracy protests. We've seen him gain back large areas of the country. So he's clearly wanting to do that. So could he be doing the same? Could he be now fighting back? And would that mean that a lot of civilians could be killed in airstrikes? That's certainly a fear that most people are having, they're telling me. At the same time, after 13 years of this war, people also do want change. Right now is a very, very uncertain time. We've already seen a lot of people have left Aleppo. A lot of people have fled their homes because of airstrikes, because of the advances of the opposition. So it's very, very uncertain. It's also hard to know how much further the opposition will go. Will they take further cities further south of Aleppo? It's very much unclear what's going to happen. There's also been some clashes reported in the capital, Damascus, separately. From what I'm hearing from analysts, from people in Syria who've spoken to, they say it's all very, very uncertain, but certainly there's very big change ahead. And the dynamics of this conflict, especially if we're looking at the last 4 years, the front lines have pretty much been frozen, and this has completely collapsed. The order has completely collapsed. So what's happening in Syria now is a huge change, and this will change the entire dynamics of the conflict, of this war that's been fought for 13 years.
I think the point is about the current Middle East is that there is no such thing as a point of stability. There are simply too many unfinished businesses, if you like, in terms of state building, boundaries, borders, and the rest of it. Nobody thought that the outcome of the Syrian civil war, which was to divide the country in four parts and have four completely less than ideal statelets existing alongside each other in the borders of Syria was going to last for forever. It was only a question of when it would break down, and the extraordinary events in Israel and Gaza and in Lebanon with the war in Hezbollah, the Ukraine war, a new president coming in the States, these big shifts in what goes on in the sort of political surround sound of Syria, if you like, not surprisingly, had a knock-on effect in the country itself.
So when we talk about the West, kind of trying to pick, I don't know, the worst of two options, the best of two options, what are the kind of things that they have to take into account when they decide, if they have to decide, who they might back?
Well, I think that is the first question: is how much involvement does the West want to have? I mean, that's the to me, I'm looking at these things over the last 20 years. That's the single biggest question, and it's a very determining factor. 20 years ago, the West seemed to think it wanted to be 25 years ago, perhaps the controlling influence of Union America. And so you saw America and Britain invade Iraq in 2003 because they wanted to reshape the Middle East. They wanted a more peaceful Middle East, a Middle East that was more obedient to UN diktats, and therefore, as America was the only superpower at the time, basically its own diktats. Whether you think that's a good thing or not, that's what they were trying to do. It obviously went badly wrong post-Iraq. And ever since then, Western policy has been divided into: do we, try and control the Middle East, or do we pull out? And Obama said he was going to sort of pivot to Asia. Trump likewise said, don't want, America first. We don't want to be running the world in the way we thought we could before. And so all the regimes, revolutionary groups, activists all thought, right, okay, well, we've got to reshape the Middle East instead. So this incredible period of chaos, but with the West still saying, oh, actually, we do have to intervene because we have to protect the Kurds, we have to protect the Christians, we have to stop, ISIS, we have to stop terrorism, we have to stop this, or we have to stop that, we have to support Israel. So we have this constant toing and froing, with the result that, we've ended up in a situation after all these wars where there isn't anybody we really want to support. There's no ideal solution, certainly in Syria, to Western interests. We just have to, try and decide what we want, how closely involved we want, and work out some of the consequences for the poor people on the ground who suffer from this sort of toing and froing. So they have taken pretty much all of the city of Aleppo, which is pretty extraordinary just in itself. If you remember, the battle for Aleppo went on for years and years, and when the Syrian war was at its height from 2012 to the end of 2016, they in 3 days they took all of a city they didn't manage to take in 4 years then, and that the regime took months and months and months to bludgeon into submission with its air force. So that's pretty extraordinary. They moved on last night further south to the next big city down down Syria from north to south. Syria is basically, if you have to think of Syria as the eastern half as being basically desert or desertified or arid, and then the western half is where most of the population live in a series of big cities from Aleppo down through Hama, Homs, Damascus and Deraa, sort of north to south. So they've taken Aleppo, and they were on the outskirts of Hama last night. But the regime did manage to get reinforcements north and keep them from entering Hama city proper. And that's where they are today. They've been made some advances, the rebels in the countryside, sort of to the northwest of the city of Hama, southwest of Aleppo, where they haven't made quite the lightning fast progress they did in the previous few days. So the regime has started to mobilize resources, and as you heard in your little bulletin, they've also summoned up the air force to start bombing some of these rebel gains.
Right. Okay. And we've talked a bit, Richard, about Russia's involvement in that, and Iran too, and how those two countries, of course, are engaged in other conflicts, perhaps that is working as a distraction in their efforts. The rebels will presumably see that as a great opportunity here, with Damascus in their sights. By all accounts, it's a little far. It's much further south from where they are at the moment. What is your sense of how likely it is that they will reach Damascus, and how secure is Damascus?
Yeah, I have a slightly different view from most people on this. I mean, no one really understands what's going on, because no one really understands the nature of this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the leading force that has taken Aleppo. It's a jihadi force. It's self-professed Islamist. It is a prescribed terror group, according to United States, Britain, and other countries. Yet it has also moderated its stance considerably in the last few years. It's divorced itself from al-Qaeda. It says it's a moderate group. It says it's a nationalist Syria group. It's not a sort of international jihadist group. It says it respects minorities, and indeed in Aleppo, seen quite striking pictures of church services carrying on in Aleppo today, even though this jihadi force have taken over. They say with they are protecting the Christians in Aleppo and other minorities there. So we don't know what it is, and now really in terms of its ideology, and that has a very important knock-on effect for our understanding of this conflict, which is how much Turkey is involved. Now, Turkey is the country to the north. Turkey backs the other rebel factions in northern Syria, the so-called, which have come under this umbrella of a thing called the Syrian National Army, which is the sort of non-jihadist rebel groups. But a lot of the aid to northern Syria goes through Hayat Tahrir al-Sham areas that comes from Turkey. There are relationships between Turkey and HTS just for practical reasons, for aid delivery and so on. So the question is, how much is this advance coordinated with Turkey? It's not credible to me that they did it without Turkey knowing, because there are factions of the Syrian National Army, this Turkish-backed group, that took part. So the Turks must have known about this. So what is the Turkish role in this? And that answers the question, to me at least, of whether they're likely to try and take Damascus. Now, I think that this is much more to do with Turkish security, Turkish politics. Turkey wants to return some of the millions of Syrian refugees living in Turkey back to Syria. It wants to secure its own borders from Kurdish forces, from other risk factors. And so I don't think it wants to envelop Syria in a sort of free-for-all that would be a jihadist attack on Damascus, which is much better protected. That's my view. Now, obviously, the rebels are saying, let's go and liberate Damascus, but I don't think that's in their sights.
Conflict in Syria significantly escalated in the last few days. Rebels they're trying to take more territory towards Damascus after their quite surprising, at least to the extent that most of us were paying attention, takeover of Aleppo. And President Assad of Syria has promised to crush them, but then he says that quite a lot. Most of us have basically, I guess, effectively forgotten about this conflict, knowing it was rumbling along in the background. Why is it intensified?
Well, because of the timing. It's because the two main rebel groups, which are the Turkish-based, or at least not in Turkey, but right by the border of Turkey, have seen an opportunity. Hezbollah has been weakened, and Hezbollah has been fighting for Assad. They've sent troops over into Syria. They've been severely weakened by the attacks in Lebanon, and also the feeling that Russia has had its eye off Syria because it's been so preoccupied with Ukraine. So Assad's two main backers have been weakened, and the rebels have seen a real chance. You're right, it has been more or less forgotten. It's sort of been rumbling along, but it's been fairly quiet recently, and they've regrouped and have had amazing success in actually capturing Aleppo.
And what's the West's interest here? Because on the one hand, our governments are no fan of Assad, and the fact that he's Russian-backed. If Russia has to devote more resources towards helping him, that's all for the good as far as we're concerned in Ukraine. But then on the other hand, the rebels, as well as being a bit Turkish-backed, they're also have links with Al Qaeda and ISIS and similar groups. Which way does our interest lie here?
Well, our interest really doesn't lie with backing the rebels. They are indeed Islamist extremists and have very close links, although they've officially broken them, with Al Qaeda. It's one of these conundrums, as they say in the Middle East. The friend of my friend is my friend, but an enemy of my enemy can still be my enemy. And we don't approve of Bashar Assad's regime. In fact, the West has really tried very hard to get rid of it, but has now basically retreated in the face of the fact that he's actually survived with more than 11 years of civil war going on there. He's firmly in power. He's back in the Arab League. So he's been sort of accepted, as it were, although not really in any way approved of, particularly because of his close association with Russia. But the West's interest really is just trying to keep out of this and make sure that either Assad or neither Assad nor the rebels win a decisive victory.
Rebel insurgents fighting President Assad's forces have launched attacks in the central province of Hama after taking the city of Aleppo in a surprise attack over several days. Iran, Assad's most significant backer, has said it will consider sending troops to Syria if requested by Damascus. Well, Aron Lund is a Syria and Middle East security expert at the Swedish Defence Research Agency and joins us now. Good evening to you, Aron.
Good evening.
We're hearing on the front page of one of the newspapers here in the UK tonight, Aleppo's residents wait in fear for Assad reprisal, and it seemed as though those rebel forces that seized Aleppo slightly took President Assad's regime by surprise. What's your understanding of the position in Syria now?
Well, I mean, it changes hour by hour. It's very difficult to say anything for certain because the information coming out of Syria is basically all propaganda from one side or the other, and you try to verify this as well as you can by looking at pictures and videos and comparing to satellite photos and so on. But the situation right now seems to be that the rebels still hold Aleppo, all of it, even though Assad's forces seem to have made some sort of a counteroffensive just south of the city. But then there's another rebel offensive by more or less the same groups, also led by this group Tahrir al-Sham or HTS, further southwest from the Idlib province, which they ruled for a long time, toward the city of Hama. And Hama is another big city, not as big as Aleppo, but an important city nonetheless, more in central Syria. And once you get to Hama, you start getting into the areas that are really core areas of the regime, of Assad's regime, and these areas are really important to the regime. So the fact that the rebels have now, in just the space of just a few days, pushed to basically the outskirts of Hama for the first time, that's something that's really worrying for the regime, I think, and that comes after losing Aleppo, which was the key, the main city of northern Syria.
President Assad has support from Iran. He also has support from Russia, and we've seen Russian airstrikes already. I mean, what do you think is going to be the extent of further foreign involvement in this conflict? We've had this long civil war in Syria. Many thought that it was more or less over, but it now does look as though there's huge instability.
Yes, and I think for both Russia and Iran, this is really serious, and they're really concerned at this situation. But they're also constrained in different ways. Russia, of course, is busy in Ukraine, has most or nearly all of its military tied up there. May find it difficult to send reinforcements to Syria, even though I should say the Syrian war is so much smaller in scale that even limited reinforcements might make a difference. But then you have Iran, which has been, supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, used Hezbollah in Syria during the civil war. And now, of course, Hezbollah is tied up in Lebanon, trying to guard against Israel there. There's a very shaky ceasefire. and the group has taken a lot of damage during that war, may not be able to help out in Syria, and Iran itself and its other regional allies that is used in Syria, they don't have the same freedom of action either, because they've been bombed by Israel in Syria for a long time, really, but especially intensively during the Lebanese war. So I think we heard the Iranian foreign minister say now that they will take into consideration any Syrian request to send troops. And of course, Iran has a big army, Revolutionary Guards, lots of forces that could come to Syria. But the question is, will they be able to get there? And once they show up, will they just be bombed by Israel? So it's unclear, actually. I don't think the regime is.
And it's a very complex situation, isn't it? I mean, I remember when David Cameron was the British Prime Minister at the height of the Civil War, openly declaring Assad must go, he must stand down. But now it seems that for countries like the UK, the United States, they're looking at these rebel forces and the involvement of groups with links to Islamic extremists, to al-Qaeda, and they don't seem to know which side to back.
Yeah, I think that is the case. They don't back either side, and I think U.S. policy, UK policy, European policy more generally has been fairly, there's not much of it. There's been some statements saying that we need a political transition and everyone should be nice, and it doesn't really matter. It's not relevant to what's going on in Syria. If they don't back either side, it doesn't matter. You have Turkey, for example, which does back the rebels, even though I think the Turks are a bit spooked by how far they've come and how much damage they've done to Assad, because they weren't ready for this. But Turkey, for example, does play a meaningful role in Syria, for good or bad. Same with Russia, same with Iran, of course. And so, but there's not really of course, the United States has influence through by backing these Kurdish factions further northeast in Syria, but that's not really central to the conflict right now.
Let me just ask you about the other. And one other aspect of the very complex picture across the Middle East, which I know you follow very closely. We saw this upsurge in fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, the Israeli forces carrying out strikes on Hezbollah targets inside Lebanon. They said that this was a response to some attacks by Hezbollah. Do you think that this is putting at risk what is supposed to be a ceasefire between the two?
I think so. I mean, I think both parties, for very different reasons, wanted the ceasefire. They may have wanted it with, more or less. But what's happened since the ceasefire was concluded is that you've seen continued tension along the border. You've seen especially Israeli strikes into Lebanon, saying that Hezbollah is cheating, Hezbollah is not doing what they should. And there was a part of the ceasefire agreement that set up a kind of a commission to investigate matters like that, complaints. But it's not really up and running yet, I think, or at least it doesn't seem to be effective. So what happened the other day was that Hezbollah, for the first time since the ceasefire, basically fired at Israel and said, this is a warning shot, stop attacking us or we'll start attacking you again. And Israel responded to that, killing 11 people. And now, where is this going to go? But I think if the United States and France and others who've been involved in setting up this ceasefire want it to last, they'll have to engage more with the parties, I think.
Now we're going to Syria, where the Syrian army says it is withdrawing from the city of Hama. This is hugely significant. It marks the second major gain for rebel forces, who also captured Aleppo last week, and nobody thought that they would be able to capture Hama. So for the latest on this, I'm now joined by the veteran international correspondent Sam Kiley. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you.
You've been closely watching this Syrian civil war for the last 14 or 15 years, and you've been to Syria. Tell us what's happened. Hama is a big surprise, isn't it?
Well, it is a big surprise, and whilst people like myself and others have been keeping an eye on Syria for a long time, I have to confess that alongside Russia and Iran, allies of the Damascus regime, we all took our eye off the ball, given the focus of events on Ukraine and Gaza, Lebanon and Israel. As a consequence of that, or taking advantage of that, Syria's rebels have swept through south from their stronghold in Idlib, as you say, through Aleppo. Now they've taken Hama almost unopposed. Hama is a very important kind of multiple crossroads. It has routes to the coast, it has routes to the interior of Syria, and of course, above all, it has routes down south through Homs and on to Damascus. Now, there'd be a lot bigger fight over these cities as the rebels approach Damascus, but they have had to rely in the past very, very heavily on Russian warplanes. And of course, Russian warplanes have been occupied very aggressively for the last nearly 3 years, and indeed earlier in Ukraine. So this is a moment in which the rebels, led by Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an Islamist organization, have been able to consolidate and then assault against what now appears to be a very, very weak central government in Damascus.
Well, look, this is a huge kind of geopolitical issue, and it's a kind of playground for the great powers. It's very kind of like the 19th century, isn't it? Because these rebels could not be doing this without Turkey's implicit or indeed explicit backing. So what is going on there?
Well, it's a very complex web. So you're right. The Turks have groups that they back in the north of the country. They back them as a kind of defensive line against any kind of opportunity taken by the Assad regime to advance. They also back some rebel groups because it's easier to rent them than fight them. And then, of course, they also back groups that are opposed to that very significant Kurdish enclave in the northeast of the country, known and because of that, the Turks are absolutely integral to this. They're very tight-lipped about what they want out of this rebel advance. You're right, it couldn't have been done without the knowledge, if not the approval, of the Turks. But the deeper they go into Syria, the more this rebel group becomes a kind of independent entity, albeit reliant on lines of supply, principally going to be coming from Turkey. Of course, sorry to interrupt, the Damascus regime is also getting support from Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed branch of Hezbollah in Iran. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, I was interrupting you, because what I wanted to ask was, what are the Russian government saying to the Turkish government then? Because the Russians obviously are backing Assad. So in effect, this is a challenge from Turkey direct at Russia.
I don't think the Turks are not directly involved in this. They don't like the Syrian regime. They want stability above all in Syria because, of course, they've had to absorb more than 1 million refugees into their own country. Turkey's also, whilst not an ally of Russia, is the only NATO partner that talks to Russia in any significant way and does have a relationship because of its control of the Bosphorus Sea and access to the Black Sea, Bosphorus Straits and the access to the Black Sea. So in that context, Turkey, as ever, straddling east and west in a very kind of delicate position. But I think it'd be unfair to suggest that the Turks are kind of driving this rebellion against the Assad regime in a very explicit way at this stage.
And you alluded to Russian jets being occupied in Ukraine. I mean, the other significant part of this advance is does it throw into kind of stark relief how weakened Russia is, obviously how weakened Iran is. They can no longer, as it were, play on more than one stage.
Well, the Russians are employing their aircraft against the rebels in country. There's a recent, I haven't had a chance to verify it myself, but allegations that once again Russian aircraft have been involved in bombing hospitals as far north as Idlib. If that's proven, that would be part of a pattern that we've seen many times before by the Russians in the campaign in Syria and indeed by the Israelis in the campaign in Gaza. If you break the ability of any organization to look after its population's health, you're very seriously undermining them. So that is definitely a campaign aim that the Russians have been able to pursue. The Iranians are saying that they will be fulsome support for the Assad regime. They have encouraged up to 50,000 fighters to go in from Iraq. We're not quite sure whether or not they've actually crossed effectively into Syrian territory and whether or not they're really going to be committed to the fight. And similarly, the Iranians, they do have personnel that they could throw at this, but they have lost that 40,000 fighters that were part of the Lebanese Hezbollah that have now been occupied in their fight with Israel. Now, that is the opportunity that has presented itself, particularly in the west of the country, for this rebel advance.
And what are the prospects for Assad? He's got to fight back. Has he got the strength to do so?
Well, it was interesting, wasn't it? He was in Russia or had gone to Russia just as this renewed rebellion got underway. There might have been an anticipation that he might choose to stay in Moscow, but he came back if his movements can be confirmed. I mean, I think that indicates that he remains at this stage fairly confident. Remember, this was a rebellion that started in his own territories, in Aleppo, in Damascus, indeed, and with a combination of ferocity and atrocity and the help of Iran and Russia and Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime was able to fight them off. So it's not over for the Assad regime yet, not by any means.
Bashar al-Assad's given his officers a 50% pay rise as they fight the Islamist-led rebels. Matt Broomfield joins us, co-founder of the Rojava Information Center operating in northern Syria. Hello to you, Matt.
Hi, John.
Matt, can you tell us what is the latest on the conflict?
It is really moving extraordinarily fast. The situation looks really quite bad for Bashar al-Assad. Of course, that doesn't mean the situation is good for ordinary Syrians. So, as you mentioned, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an al-Qaeda offshoot who have governed large regions of northwest Syria, have been pushing south very fast, very hard, and very effectively after many years of a relatively frozen conflict. They've taken, as you mentioned, 2 of Syria's 4 largest cities. Another major city is now in their crosshairs, and if that city should fall and the Assad regime continues to collapse, then we could even see Assad finally resigning power in Syria after 13 years of such brutal conflict.
Right, so if we're looking at a real possibility of Assad falling, his government falling, what would come next? What would that mean?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, unfortunately, while there are many people who would rightly be delighted to see Assad, who's responsible for the bulk of deaths in Syria, fall from office, what comes next would also be pretty ugly. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham imposed an authoritarian interpretation of Islam and region under their control, so particularly threatening to minorities and to women in Syria. And they also have jailed thousands of opposition activists and media workers. So for those living in those regions, the situation would be grave. And there are also particular threats toward the Kurds, so the West's Kurdish allies, because alongside this advance from HTS, Turkish-backed groups have also seized the opportunity. And whereas HTS have focused their attacks on Assad, the Turkish-backed militias have been concentrating on executing violence against the Kurdish minority in the country. There have been reports of atrocities against Kurdish civilians trying to flee, probably around 100,000 already displaced, many more to follow. And the fear is there'll be a total collapse. Assad will leave, HTS will get control, and we perhaps might even see the US presence ultimately driven out of the country as a new reality takes place on the ground.
Right, a significant shifting of the pieces. And you mentioned the Kurds. There'll be other minorities fearful of an HTS takeover.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, HTS, they're an al-Qaeda offshoot. They have pragmatically reformed a little bit in recent years. And so far, their advance has generally been marked by relative restraint. I mean, I say relative because there have been reports of at least 2 members of the Yazidi minority executed. The Christians that we're in contact with in Aleppo, this major city now under their control, are in a state of extreme fear. And HTS has, executed, or HTS's predecessor has executed members of the Druze minority, targeted Christians' properties in the past. But there is a certain degree of sense that for now HTS is trying to play nice. It's trying to focus on Assad. HTS itself is not picking a fight with the Kurds at this time or with the Christians necessarily, and is making overtures towards those minority groups. Now, that's not the case for the Turkish-backed militias known as the SNA, and they are engaging in retributive violence against the Kurds, against the Yazidis, and against the Christian minority. And there's a particular fear that their attacks are going to continue towards the Euphrates River and into those Kurdish-held territories, which for so long have been a safe haven for the Christians and the Yazidis and other minority groups in Syria.
The removal of Assad after so long in power would be a big, big moment. But just for context, Matt, just give us a bit of a picture of what that would mean strategically for the region.
Well, I mean, there are a number of reasons why this advance has come now. Of course, one of them is that Bashar al-Assad is running out of friends. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. It's busy in Ukraine. And Assad has long relied on support and an alliance with Iran. But of course, Iran and Hezbollah have both been taking significant blows from Israel in Syria and throughout the region. And so a sort of a fall of Assad would mean a pushback for those interests, but it wouldn't necessarily be fantastic news for the West, since the West has generally is on the back foot in recent years. In Syria, in particular, the United States and by extension the UK are unwilling to stick their necks out, and it's Turkey who really stand to gain. Ankara has long sort of positioned itself somewhere in between these two power blocks, sort of mediating between and using its position as a middleman to secure its own agenda. And Ankara is very happy the Turkish flag is flying from the citadel in Aleppo. And what Turkey would like, I think, is certainly for Assad to fall, for Turkish occupation to extend deep into sovereign Syrian territory, for the Americans to leave or at least to draw back their presence to the very west of the country, and for Turkey to become the dominant actor.
Okay, so let's just extend the hypothesis a little bit further. For the United States, you say their troop presence could be forced to change, and Britain's going to be watching this very closely too. What exactly would be at stake for those Western powers, like Britain, like the USA?
Sure. So the presence on the ground of the UK and the US is confined to the Kurdish-led northeast of the country, which, as people remember, remains allied with the West in the fight against ISIS. That region is important primarily, perhaps, as the key staging ground for the continued operations against ISIS. There are ISIS sleeper cells still very much at large and active in the centre of the country. And it's also important as the one kind of island in the region which isn't under the direct influence of Iran or one of its proxies. So a change in the situation on the ground, which would result in chaos, which might result, therefore, in a severing of those Western lines into the country, would certainly result, I think, in an ISIS resurgence. ISIS would certainly seek to profit from the chaos, and perhaps also, as I said, with the Western drawdown, which would ultimately, that chaos could play into Iran's hands.
No, reason clearly for concern there. And just a few thoughts on Bashar al-Assad, who has been this prominent figure in that region for so long.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think the headline for Assad really is that he is running out of friends. Syria has long been a key staging ground for Hezbollah and Iran to pursue their own interests, for Russia to pursue their own interests. We shouldn't forget that Russia has a major naval installation on the Syrian coast, which is a key kind of site for Russian power projection contra the West in the Middle East. And Assad, he himself, in a sense, is quite weak, as we've seen with this rapid collapse. His armed forces are weak, and he's relied on those relationships with other authoritarian powers in the region to maintain his hold on his throne at any cost. What we're seeing now is that precarious grip might finally be slipping, but he has managed to cling to power for a very long time at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. So I don't think anyone should be getting too optimistic yet, and it may well be that he finds a way to keep holding on.
Right, so I need to follow that very closely as well. Look, before you leave us, Matt, let me just cast your mind over to the situation of Iran, which has been under an enormous amount of pressure. It has effectively seen, the removal, of very significant removal of its proxies, chiefly Hezbollah, under all sorts of pressure and the promise of more when Donald Trump takes over in the White House. There's another big player looking at a very different future.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Syria will be one bellwether for where Iran stands right now. Iran has stated in recent days that it is ready and willing to send reinforcements somehow to Syria. The question is, will Iran actually do that? Is Iran currently in a position, given its much weakened position and the attacks on its proxies, to make any such an intervention? And will it do that, or will it choose to sit on its hands? So what you might well see is there has already been reported members of Iranian-controlled Shia militias in neighboring Iraq crossing the border into Syria to join the conflict, and that would be one thing which might A, change the tide in Syria, or at least halt the flow in Syria, and B, indicate that Iran is ready to intervene and continue battling against its opponents in the region. But it might also be that Iran feels itself too weak, and that they'll be more concentrated on repressing any potential rumblings on the domestic scene.
Now, it is 8:08. Syrian rebels say they've captured a second major city after the country's military withdrew its troops from Hama. The leader of the Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, referred to as HTS, declared victory and said they'd freed hundreds of those wrongfully detained from a central prison. The same group, of course, captured Aleppo at the weekend. Let's speak to James Jeffrey now, former US Special Envoy to Syria and former United Nations President's Deputy National Security Advisor. James, good evening.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me on.
I'm great, thank you. Look, this story had gone a little bit quiet over the last few days as intense fighting continued in Hama. And now that militant group, the Islamist militant group, HTS, has taken Hama and they are now headed for Damascus.
There's one more city on the way, Homs, but they have got momentum. I've been on the receiving end of rapidly advancing armies in Vietnam in 1972. It's very hard psychologically to stop them. It isn't about weapons or soldiers or rifles on the ground. It's about will to defend versus will to attack. And the attackers have the will to attack, and they have victory after victory behind them. There are signs all over that the Assad regime is cracking, that people are abandoning positions, that government people are finding other things to do than be at work in Damascus. And these are all indications that we last saw in Kabul in 2021.
Look, the UN World Food Programme has said this escalation, this sweeping offensive by HTS, in which Aleppo went and now Hama, means that 280,000 people have been displaced. There's a lot of suffering within the region anyway. And that this rapid offensive is essentially unsettling some of Assad's longtime backers in Moscow and in Tehran, Russia, in Iran. How will each of those nations respond? We know that Russian forces have come to the rescue of the Syrian army, but how much more involvement are we going to see from those two nations? Because at the moment, the Syrian army is not withstanding the pressure from HTS.
Well, it's going to take, I think the Russians have somewhere between 7 and 10 operable airplanes in Syria. They can't get reinforcements there, even if they have them, given the Ukraine war, because they have to overfly Turkey, and they won't be able to. The Iranians have very little to give. They have been badly beaten by the Israelis in the two missile offensives. The Iranians never committed ground troops. The main ground troops they committed was Hezbollah, and Hezbollah, of course, is no longer available. They have been badly defeated by the Israelis. What this shows is that Iran and its proxies and Russia in happily going on the offensive, in part because we in the West sent them signal after signal that we wouldn't, seriously push them back. We found out that people on the ground, be it Israelis, be it Syrians, be it Ukrainians, don't want to be ruled by these people.
Yeah. What happens to the Syrian army now? We know we've talked about desertions from the army, fighters fleeing their positions. I mean, they seem to be completely unprepared for this offensive. How does President Assad try and get a grip on this?
Oh, well, he can't. There's certain things you can do. Basically, it depends on certain officers. Now, his brother, Maha, in the 4th Armored Division, that has been in the south. That's considered an ideologically loyal force. But I suspect that rather than throw that into the battle up south of Hama, that unit more likely is defending the presidential palace. And if all you have left is the people defending the presidential palace, you've lost the country. That's the problem. You need enough troops to defend the whole country. Right now, Assad isn't producing them.
And where does this go?
Well, I don't know. It's not a good thing to have a organization on a terror list, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, take over a country. But on the other hand, they are closely coordinated with Turkey, which is going to be very careful because it has very important relations with us, with Russia, with Europe. And the experience of these Islamic groups, particularly Daesh or the Islamic State in Syria, is they repel more citizens than they recruit. and therefore HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, will have to be very careful. But the larger point is, for many years now, the biggest threat in the region has not been Sunni Islamic terrorists, although they're a real problem. The real threat has been Iran and its proxies, and they've just suffered yet another defeat. The last one standing are the Houthis, because the U.S. assigned itself the job of taking them down, and of course we failed miserably. But on every other front, the Israelis and now the Turkish-backed Syrian opposition is dealing defeat after defeat to Iran. This is, in the larger scheme of things, a good thing.